straight, every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways made smooth, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God.
Some time ago, I made an amazing discovery. I discovered that having a son who is 40 plus years old isn't as depressing as I thought it would be. And I found out that Jason, my 40 plus year old son, has gained a marvelous perspective on life after all. Now, during one of our get-togethers, Jason and I had a lengthy conversation concerning house cleaning, of all things. It seems that Jason had taken on the daunting task of cleaning the house that he shares with his brother. He declared that he now understood why I moaned, groaned, and complained every time I had to clean. "It's terrible," he said. "Now I get it. Picking up all that clutter and stuff and then dusting, vacuuming, and polishing is hard work. No wonder you only cleaned when company was coming." Actually, I may have cleaned more often than that, but not much more. And what I remember from those house cleaning days was all the clutter that had to be cleared away before I could even begin to dust and vacuum. There were piles of dirty clothes, wet towels, stinky socks, shin guards, and soccer cleats, books, and those tiny little Lego blocks that were often chewed up and spit out by the vacuum cleaner. There were Star Wars lightsabers and piles of junk mail. I blamed everyone and anyone for making messes that I ended up clearing away. Everyone in the house became a target. My husband, the children, the dogs and cats, and I think I may have even blamed the gerbil and the tropical fish. But then my sons grew up, and I was divorced and began living by myself. I've lived alone for a long time, and now when I'm forced to clear a path in my study or bedroom, I have no one to blame but myself. After all, I have to admit, my cat isn't that messy. Now, I'm confessing all this because here we are in the second week of Advent, and we're being told to clear a path and straighten up our lives. We're supposed to be getting rid of all the dust and debris, and it doesn't really have much to do with house cleaning. Today, we're pulled into the distant past to hear the words of the ancient prophet Malachi. Scholars tell us that we really don't know much about Malachi. Perhaps he was a priest who was disgruntled with the practices of his fellow priests. Malachi's message was meant for the people of Judah and Jerusalem who had returned from the Babylonian exile. As you might expect from hearing our passage this morning, life wasn't going very well. People were upset and disappointed. They felt they deserved a whole lot more from God than they had received. They reasoned that somehow God had shortchanged them, and on top of that, the priests weren't exactly behaving as priests should. In other words, there was a whole lot of moaning, groaning, complaining, and corruption going on. God seemed far away, distant, unconcerned, and uncaring. Enter Malachi, who offers a vision of a messenger who will come to prepare the way. Someone is about to show up, and that messenger from God will purify people's hearts. Malachi speaks of a refiner or silversmith, someone who's able to restore and refine metal so that it shines with luster and brilliance. As one writer points out, the refining process is complete only when one can observe their own image in the mirror-like surface of the metal. So Malachi speaks words of restoration for a people who are dull and disillusioned. future, Malachi tells everyone God's promise of restoration will happen. But it will happen in God's way, whether people are ready for it or not. A few centuries later, we hear about another priest named Zechariah, who is married to Elizabeth. Now, Zechariah and Elizabeth are getting up in years, and they don't have any children. It seems as though the Bible is full of these stories, isn't it? Anyway, Zechariah finds himself leading prayers for the people at the temple, and as he goes through the ritual sayings, his mind is really elsewhere as he prays. Zechariah finds himself praying to God about the sadness he feels because he and his wife don't have any children. Well, if you can believe it, an angel or a messenger shows up and announces that God has heard Zechariah's prayer and that indeed his wife will have a son who will be named John. Well, all this strikes our Papa Zechariah as really strange and bizarre, and he isn't at all sure that it's true. Our Papa Zechariah is truly at a loss for words. So much so that he can't speak at all for the next 9 months until John is born. And that brings us to the first reading from Luke. Zechariah is finally able to talk, and here's what he had to say. The words of Zechariah that Don read are all about love, praise, and hope for the future. This is truly a song rather than a speech. It's a song telling us all about God at work in the world throughout the history of the Hebrew people. This song praises the promise God made to the people even as their enemies were threatening their very lives. The song sings of the love and mercy God has poured out on the people and how God has protected them. Then the song Zechariah sings goes on to proclaim hope for the future. He looks at his newborn son and knows that John is destined to be a prophet who will clear a path for the one who is yet to come. Now, this is truly a song that brings us the gift of light in the midst of darkness and declares that there will be a path to peace someday. And that brings us to our second reading in Luke. The baby has grown up to become the man people call John the Baptist. Wouldn't you just know it? He shows up at a time when people find themselves in many of the same circumstances as their ancestors who were around when Malachi was preaching. The author of the Gospel of Luke writes as a good historian should. This writer places John in a particular time and place by reciting the names of important people who were in power at the time. The author offers names of both secular and religious leaders. It wasn't an accident that this gospel writer names the powerful and mighty. By contrast, John appears on the scene as someone who is unimportant and unremarkable. And from these ordinary circumstances comes a powerful messenger who tells everyone it's time for a change. John, like most prophets, tells it like it is. John's message to people brings both a warning and a promise. Now, in these weeks of Advent, as we continue with our preparations and clearing away the clutter, we're happy to hear about the promise of God, but we might not be so thrilled to hear about a warning. That the warning is part of the promise. The warning is really an opportunity for us to get ourselves turned around. That's what repentance means, to turn around and come back. The promise and the warning are both tied up together in God's encircling love and forgiveness. John the Messenger has a way of interrupting our schedules, demanding that we make preparations beyond straightening up our homes. John demands we get ready for Jesus by taking a good, hard look at our values and our priorities. Now this is a story about clearing a path in our lives and getting ourselves straightened out. Marty didn't feel as sick as he really was. Other than a little shortness of breath, he felt fine. But the doctor was brutally honest. Marty needed bypass surgery. His late wife had been a wonderful cook, so Marty had enjoyed years of great Austrian foods with loads of delicious cheese and butter. Since his wife's death, Marty had taken up cooking himself and discovered that it wasn't half bad. But the wild cholesterol ride was over, and now he found himself learning to like spinach without the cream, green beans without the bacon bits, and an assortment of green delicacies he had never before attempted: artichokes, zucchini, and asparagus. In addition to the dietary changes, Marty began a sweeping reassessment of his inner life and outer relationships, especially with his family. All this was coming right before Christmas, and it occurred to Marty that as the world was busily going mad with superficialities, he was being driven deeper and deeper into his soul. Marty had never been a particularly religious man, but more and more frequently he found himself lost in prayer. Marty and his late wife Hazel had raised two daughters who over the years had become quite distant from Marty and each other. So at this point in their separate lives, everyone was politely estranged. Birthday and Christmas cards were exchanged regularly, but there really wasn't much other contact. Marty took no comfort from the fact that Karen and Brenda would have nothing to do with one another either. They had always been fiercely competitive, and as Marty looked back, he realized that he had encouraged the competition. Now, without leaving the country, they could not have lived farther apart. Marty lived just outside Denver. Karen was an attorney in Tampa, and Brenda had her own computer business in Spokane. Neither daughter was married. Karen declared she was not about to pass on any of her ice-cold family genes. Brenda simply didn't have time for relationships. Marty wasn't sure when the final falling out had occurred, but he thought it might have something to do with a doll. After his wife had died, the girls tried to straighten up the house a bit for Marty. In sorting through their mother's things, they found a foolish old plastic doll with a pull string that used to make it say things like, "I love you and you're new." Each girl insisted the broken doll belonged to her. A screaming match ensued, and Brenda ended up taking the doll home with her. Apparently, that incident was the last straw in a lifetime of trying to share what there was really not enough of. Perhaps Marty's daughters were better off at opposite ends of the country. Now, even though his family life was a snarl, Marty had some great friends. And so one day, Marty found himself confiding in his neighbor and best friend, Roland. Roland had undergone similar surgery, and he was extremely supportive. He understood better than any of Marty's other friends just what he was going through. Without Marty knowing, Roland called Marty's daughters and told them quite frankly that their father was very ill. Furthermore, Roland declared, their father would never ask them to come. However, Marty needed his daughters to be there for his surgery. Karen felt torn in two. She was wrapping up a big criminal case. Her defense had gone well. In fact, she hoped to secure a favorable verdict the next day. Did her father really need her? Did he need anyone? In any event, she simply couldn't leave until the trial was over, and she didn't know when that would be. She thought about calling her father, but decided not to. Instead, she sent him a big bouquet of Mylar get-well-soon balloons. Brenda got off the phone with Roland and blurted out a sharp, "Ha!" She couldn't imagine her father with a broken heart. She told her assistant, Tracy, "How can a man have triple bypass surgery when he doesn't have a heart?" In the end, Brenda left Tracy with instructions for the next few days and went home to pack. Brenda decided to drive her brand new SUV and break it in. She could scream all the way to Colorado and get it all out of her system before she arrived. She would find a place to stay that night and drive all the next day and arrive before the surgery. But plans didn't quite go her way. It seems that after she packed all the necessities in the back seat, Brenda ran back into her house to receive a very battered-looking doll, which she placed in the passenger seat next to her. After a restful night in Butte, she spent the following day driving. She called her assistant twice with business details, and from time to time, she had biting little conversations with the doll. By late afternoon, Brenda encountered some annoying snow flurries, and by the time she got to Casper, dense snow was falling down from the clouds. Soon the snow became relentless and furious. Brenda was forced to stop in Cheyenne because the police had closed the road. Thankfully, Brenda was able to find a room in a very quaint and expensive place called the Fox Farm Inn. The inn had a small bar, full of other weary travelers trying to warm up their insides. Brenda ended up sitting next to a woman named Christine, who was on her way home to her family in Fort Collins. Eventually, the topic of conversation turned to parents, and Brenda spoke of her uncomfortable predicament. In the strangely just ways of God's universe, Christine revealed the loss of a younger brother in a tragic car accident. You know, Christine remarked, there's no time for pettiness. Life can be altogether too brief. Karen wasn't at all pleased when the jury offered a guilty verdict to her client. It was the custom in Karen's law firm that no matter what the outcome, the lead counsel always treated the entire legal team to the ultimate nachos at the local courthouse hangout. So over a heaping plate full of cheese-laden nachos, Karen explained her family situation to her colleague, Gabe, who was surprisingly unsympathetic. Just go, he said. You might be sorry if you don't. Karen explained it would be a whole lot easier if she knew her sister wouldn't be there. Be fearless, Gabe responded. You're both 10 years older. She probably doesn't bite. Karen booked a flight to Denver, and upon her arrival, rented a car. Eventually, Karen found her way home. She took a deep breath as she pulled into the driveway. Marty was shocked to see his daughter. He was embarrassed and delighted that his friend Roland had called her. It was a gift he would never forget. The conversation between father and daughter was a bit strained, but it wasn't as bad as Karen expected. She was amazed by the wonderful lunch and dinner her father prepared in his balloon-filled kitchen. The roads were reopened by morning. Brenda, who was exhausted, took her time leaving Cheyenne. She met Christine and wished her a good trip home. Christine said a funny thing that would keep Brenda's mind occupied the rest of the way to Denver. Bitterness is a prison that masquerades as a fortress, she said. By the time Brenda got to the hospital, her father was in surgery. She met Karen in the waiting room, said nothing, but handed her sister the doll that had kept her company all the way in Spokane. Karen graciously reached out and took the gift. Brenda and Karen, as they waited for word about their father, spent several hours becoming acquainted and began the often awkward process of forgiveness. Long after Marty had recovered, Brenda would reflect to Karen that the